Look, it's a real honour for the Archaeology of New South Wales to host the CTM conference this year. I'd like to thank Corinne and Mark for choosing Sydney and Melbourne as a location for your conference. We have a very strong museum culture in Australia, which I think international visitors will come to realise over the coming days. And it's a museum culture that dates right back to the 19th century. Quite different, in fact, from say, Abu Dhabi, for example. We have a slightly different situation here from the United States, where out here we're more like the European model, where we have strong government support, but an increasing need to raise our own funds, either through philanthropy or through commercial activities. But all of us who work in the museum sector here, I think you could say, are very optimistic about our future. In the next few minutes, Richard and I want to talk about the architecture of optimism. And I should say that Richard, as an architect, is not only one of Australia's leading architects, he has particular experience working with Utzon in the renovations of the Opera House, and also here he designed our last edition in 2003 and is a lifetime governor of the Archaeology of New South Wales. He's designed exhibitions here and is a great friend of ours. So Richard and I are going to talk about the architecture of optimism. And we have two propositions. Architecture helps communicate the museum and its collections, and also optimism should inspire ambition. What you see up here is unfortunately not the Archaeology of New South Wales, you might have guessed. This, in fact, the Archaeology of New South Wales was founded in 1871 in what's often been called the Age of Optimism in the late 19th century. And for me, I've been here about 2.5 years now, and as I research the history of Sydney, to me it's the international exhibition here in 1879 that marks Sydney's first moment of great international cultural ambition. In 1879, we hosted the international exhibition, and this garden palace was built to house it. It was designed by James Barnett, the colonial architect, who also designed, amongst other buildings, the General Post Office in the city, now the facade of the Western Hotel. The dome was 65 metres high. Unfortunately, not all optimism leads to permanent results, and in 1882, the Garden Palace burnt down. One very, very bad thing came out of that, and that was a lot of the initial collections of Indigenous art and objects from Sydney were being stored in the museum. So a huge proportion of those early objects, really the history of the local people from the Eora Nation was lost. But the burning down of the museum, of the palace, did spark the desire to build a new building for the Archaeology of New South Wales. And that was designed by Walter Liberty Vernon, and that's the facade you would have seen walking into the museum. Another great piece of optimism, you might have noticed the names of artists across the corners of the building. Artists such as Giotto, Leonardo, Raphael, Rembrandt, Michelangelo, none of whom are in our collection. But you can't go beyond that for optimism. We do have one painting by Gainsborough, so we're on our way, I think. But I think all of us in Sydney realise that the Archaeology of New South Wales has failed to keep up with the growth of the city, the cultural ambitions of the city, and the changing populations of the city. And as Corinne mentioned and Mark mentioned, we are about to embark on a very ambitious project here. We're calling the project Sydney Modern, and our aim is to have an expanded building by 2021, which will be our 150th anniversary. We are aiming to make this so not just an expansion, but also a transformation to turn this, what was originally a late 19th century art museum, into a genuinely 21st century art museum. To do this, though, we believe we must first of all understand our site. You can see here it is a very, very beautiful and spectacular site. The site for the expansion is going down over 2 concrete slabs, one over the Kyle Expressway and one over disused World War II Navy oil reservoir. This site is a very significant site. We are about 10 kilometres north of the site of first interaction between English explorers and the Indigenous people of this region in Botany Bay. Within within sight of our museum around Sydney Harbour, you can, from a site from here, this is where in 1788 the first English settlers established a penal colony in Sydney. And this is where, again, the first lasting interactions took place between Europeans and Aboriginal Australians. That is something very, very important for us, and we must remember that as we design our new building and we program our building. We sit within the greater area here is the Royal Botanic Gardens and Domain Trust. This fenced off part here is the Botanic Gardens, and the rest of it is comprised of the domain. And this means we will have a significant landscape component of our building without any doubt. But the other thing we have to think about is, as an art museum, we have to build our links with the city and with the harbour. And you can see we have a beautiful location, but it's a little bit aside from the city. And our architecture and our planning has to somehow bring the art museum, expanded art museum, build connections with the CBD to the west and Woolloomooloo precinct to the east, and also down to the harbour. And so now Richard will have perhaps a few words to say about the idea about linking the museum to the city.
I think we've had many long discussions about this very ambitious project, and many of them focus on, you know, fundamental issues like what is the role of an art museum in the city, what is its past role, and what's our ambitions for its future role. And I think I'd like to make a number of points which apply specifically to art museums, because that's what we're talking about, but they generally apply to other cultural institutions as well. It's almost hard to think of any great city of the world without thinking simultaneously about its cultural institutions. They define their character, their collections, their vision defines many things about the people and the place in which they were built. They present, I guess, a snapshot of the values of that community, what they valued in the past, and what their vision is for the future. It's interesting, I think, for me, with an interest in art, to trace different cultures that I'm not familiar with, initially through their art. And I suppose we all do that because it's easier than trying to trace the history in other ways. Because I think the artist in society, historically, is helped define who we are, how we live, what we value, how we feel about ourselves. Art's a source of ideas and debate and contemporary inspiration. And thus, I think, because of that, it gives us tangible and enduring evidence of our past. I think it's important, particularly in this project, to think that national and local identity is becoming more and more important in an increasing global world where we're surrounded by international ideas and symbolisms. And I think it's this sense of who we are, where we are, this local identity, that gives a project and an institution its true authenticity to a people, a place, and a time. And I think another point we've been debating is the fact that the art museum clearly in its collections can tell a rich story of place, of history, of aspirations, but it also, the architecture can help that process. And I think Michael will say more about that in a minute. I'd just like to finish with just a few snapshot statistics. I know probably about half the audience are visitors to the city, but this will just give you a sort of context within which this project is emerging. As Mark said in the introduction, This is one of the youngest cities crafted onto one of the world's oldest cultures with a continuous artistic tradition spanning thousands of years. Sydney's one of the central area of Sydney is one of the fastest growing in Australia, nearly double the growth rate of the surrounding metropolis. It has a resident population of 200,000 in the core, and that's also growing at double the rate. It has a mean average age of 32 against the metropolis of 36. So it's young, vibrant, energetic. There's 500,000 visitors a day come into the core of the city to work, to shop, to be entertained, but importantly, to be inspired. There are over 4 million hotel visitors a year in the centre of the city. It generates a quarter of the gross domestic product of the whole of the state. Nearly half of the residents of the core were born overseas, and 34% of the residents speak a language other than English at home. And most importantly, and most interestingly, the city has one of the largest communities of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So this is the context, this is the exciting context in which this ambitious project is emerging. It's also emerging from a period where there has been limited investment in cultural infrastructure in this city. And there's a growing realisation that to compete in a global world, our cultural institutions are an essential part of a creative city that attracts business, investment, tourism, and creates a more livable city. And we're fortunate that the New South Wales Government and the City of Sydney are both committed to this vision. And Sydney Modern has that optimistic context. So I think I'm going to hand over to Michael now, who'll talk about art, the links between art and architecture.
Thanks, Richard.
And I'll interject when you say something I don't agree with.
Okay, go ahead. Try your best. So I want to say a few words now about art in architecture. I think we'd all agree that viewing art in an art museum should inspire optimism, if nothing else. Here are some of the reasons I believe that's the case. Viewing art in an art museum gives you a connection with the human creative achievements through multiple art forms. It gives the affirmation of the civic purpose of an art collection. It gives you the possibility of lifelong learning. And also, if I'm really being optimistic, it should allow for and encourage and be inspiration for social change. It is architecture that distinguishes the museum art experience. It is about encountering art in a three-dimensional space. It's following physical pathways through various art and cultural narratives. It's experiencing art in different sort of light. Daylight sometimes, artificial light other times. Darkness when it comes to, say, video or certain sorts of performance. It's sharing a communal civic space. It is very different from a lone digital experience on a computer. And also, it is viewing art while that art is connected through views, if your museum has windows, not all do. Ours does, thank goodness. It's viewing art and having that art linked to the city through views to that city. But the big question for us at the Art Gallery of New South Wales is, what then is a 21st century art museum? That's what we're trying to achieve by 2021. But I say it's probably still a bit of an open question. But here are some of the things that we're thinking of. It's about new uses of your collection. And I hope while you're here you have a chance to look at our total reinstallation of our Asian collections that opened about a week ago. They're on 2 separate floors. The upper level in the gallery that Richard designed. And in that exhibition we are combining our historical Asian collections with interjections of contemporary Asian works of art and putting those pieces in conversation with each other. New types of spaces. So our new building will hopefully have a cinematheque, more spaces for different sorts of performance, whether just a performance art or just straight performance. And also a new type of spaciousness. So when you see our pop art exhibition, it's in that we've actually dismantled a whole floor of collection galleries to give the 200 works in this exhibition of international and Australian pop art some breathing space, and to give a more expansive architectural experience of that art, rather than a feeling of being processed through a ticketed sort of experience where you come in the front door into a dark space, are pushed along the walls, reading labels as you go, and then are spewed out the other end into the shop. Not that we don't have a shop, of course. New digital experiences, and my colleague Sarah Kenderdine from the University of New South Wales is giving a presentation during this conference. She's doing amazing work with her colleagues on sort of augmented reality, ways of evoking the presence of historical monuments in an art museum. As it becomes harder for us to collect in the field of historical Asian art, can you supplement that or replace that in some ways with augmented reality experiences of the architecture in which those works of art were originally installed? Last week in Canberra, Glenn Lowry, the director of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, gave a lecture about what he calls the participatory museum. And that's something we're thinking about. He points out in his lecture that at MoMA in New York, 85% of their visitors come to the museum with someone else. Again, the vast majority of visitors are not lone visitors having a lone experience. And they're looking at ways they can, for example, privilege practice over theory. And it's about being museum visitors being participants and not just consumers. Which also means, I think, that art museums should also be producers of content, not just consumers. And in Australia, it means sort of we want to not just be importers of culture, but we also want to produce cultural projects here and export them as well. A 21st century art museum should be much more than an air-locked, air-conditioned box with a front door. We are striving to have a much more indoor-outdoor museum, a museum that links with our extraordinary setting here, adjacent to the Royal Botanic Gardens and Sydney Harbour. And finally, we all know we need sustainable buildings. We need art museums that behave responsibly in the 21st century in terms of using energy and in terms of the way we expose our art to light and to human experience. At the beginning, I said that we believe that architecture helps communicate the museum and its collection, but that leaves the question, how do you give physical form to this sort of vision of the 21st century? I think it's fair to say we all know new art museums that tend to communicate the architect more than the museum or the collection. And Rich is now going to say a few words about how we intend to avoid that dilemma here in Sydney.
I think we're running out of time, so I'll be very, very brief. The process started with a very elaborate and exhaustive master planning, look at what we have here, what the history and character of the building is, what are its deficiencies, and to flesh out the vision that Michael and his colleagues have just articulated, and to see how, I guess, impediments the physical infrastructure put in the way of realising that vision. It became very evident that the building was nowhere near big enough, and it needed nearly to double in its scale to just keep pace with what was happening in the rest of the country, let alone what was happening abroad. Many options were looked at as to where it should expand, and clearly the expansion will happen to the north. And then the trustees became involved approving that broad strategy and crafting a process that would get an architect that was most appropriate to realise the vision to work collaboratively with the gallery, and that process has started. Government, various layers of government and stakeholders were brought in, and the city as well, to discuss the issues and to collaborate with us. Where do I change it? We've set up a two-stage national and international competition. It starts in the first stage with 12 architects, firms of architects that have been selected locally and abroad, and you can see by that impressive list here the practices around the globe that have agreed to participate in this first phase of the competition. The entries are due in just before Christmas, and the second stage, 5 of those will be selected to proceed to a second stage, which will be announced about the middle of the year. There's a very eminent jury, which I won't go into, that has museum experts chaired by Michael, with artists and landscape architects and local architects and international. So we're very optimistic about the future of this site. So thank you very much.
Thank you.